Yesterday, we were talking about the philosophical concept of freedom and its relation to aesthetic education and the normative violence that philosophical conceptualizations in the West normalize in the name of reason. We were thinking about that in relation to Haneke and to Plato and Badiou, among others. Today we're going to continue thinking about the concept of freedom, but in relation to a different set of texts and by way of considering the difference between psychoanalysis and philosophy on this question, especially insofar as psychoanalysis makes it possible to articulate the antagonism within the philosophical tradition and give a name to it that can help us understand something about queerness. In attempting to convince the people of the free states what slavery really is, Harriet Jacobs, writing as Linda Brent in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and this is a text that she published after she escaped from slavery in the South and was living in the North, but was still under threat of being sent back to her owner in the South because the Supreme Court had declared the legality of the Fugitive Slave Act, which meant that all states, even non-slave owning states, were required to return escaped slaves to the states from which they had escaped. When she wrote this text, in order to, as she puts it, convince the people of the free states what slavery really is, she repeatedly turned to the image of a child, especially a female child, the better to drive home the horrors of slavery. Whether narrating the torment of women in slavery denied access to their children, or depicting the terror of those children on discovering what having a master means, she repeatedly correlates the institution's monstrosity with its violations of sexual and familial norms that expose children in slave-owning households, children raised in the master's family, as well as children raised among his slaves, to what Harriet Jacobs identifies as, quote, the unclean influences everywhere around them, unquote. Slavery, which she characterizes in a memorable phrase as, quote, that cage of obscene birds, unquote, becomes for Jacobs the paradigm of queerness as bad education, as a violent pedagogy of corruption that leaves a, quote, blight on children's souls, unquote. Displaying everywhere an overtly eroticized economy of enjoyment visible in the slave owner's absolute power over the bodies of the enslaved, slavery inculcates, in Jacobs' view, a generalized subversion of the law by means of the very law it establishes, which is to say, a law that openly acknowledges the surcharge of enjoyment, the obscene foundation on which it rests. In exempting the slaveholder's relation to his slaves from legal norms elsewhere in force, because defining that relation as one to chattel or property instead of to a rights-bearing subject, slave law authorizes the enjoyment to which access is otherwise possible primarily by virtue of transgressing the law. It thus opens a dangerous conceptual space within which the legal protection of persons becomes inseparable from the concomitant spectacle of possible persons, since the slave can pass from the condition of property to that of subject, after all. Possible persons made objects of pure enjoyment and placed, by virtue of the law itself, outside the protection of the law. If this calls to mind the state of exception and the condition that Giorgio Agamben associates with the figure of homo sacer, who suffers abandonment by the law, it produces more immediately for Jacobs a threat to the sovereignty of the moral or natural law that she believes should govern the laws of the state. Such natural law, in Jacobs' argument, retains its full significance even when seemingly suspended by the power of the state. This finds expression in the well-known passage where Jacobs discusses the intuition by those enslaved in the South that northern newspapers might have information about the legality of their enslavement that was being concealed from them by Southern politicians. She writes, "One woman begged me to get a newspaper and read it over. She said her husband told her that the black people had sent word to the Queen of America that they were all slaves, that she didn't believe it and went to Washington City to see the president about it. They quarreled. She drew her sword upon him and swore that he should help her to make them free. That poor, ignorant woman thought America was governed by a queen to whom the president was subordinate. I wish the president was subordinate to Queen Justice," unquote. Lauren Berlant, in her account of this passage, trenchantly notes that Jacobs uses it to, quote, show how dominated people find ways to sustain their hopefulness in a cruel world, unquote, and to demonstrate that, quote, the kinds of invention, innovation, and improvisation her illiterate interlocutor practiced with only a partial knowledge could be used radically for the reimagination of collective political life within the nation, unquote. To this I would add that it also invokes the sovereignty superior to written law that functions for Jacobs as the only ground on which the legitimacy of the law can rest. In that sense, the figure of a higher law embodied by the Queen of America can indeed be used radically, as Berlant rightly puts it, but radically in the sense of lacking a specific political content or orientation, in the sense, that is, of its availability to sustain antithetical ideological positions and socio-political beliefs. For this fantasy of an embodied justice whose ultimate sovereignty sustains the law does more than inspire the dominated to hopefulness about reimagining collective political life. As Jacobs writes while explaining her refusal after having escaped to the North to consider purchasing her freedom from the man who still claimed her as a slave, quote, I knew the law would decide that I was his property and would probably still give his daughter a claim to my children. But I regarded such laws as the regulations of robbers who had no rights that I was bound to respect, unquote. Such opposition of a natural or moral law to the written law of the state establishes the basis for every form of antinomian practice and subtends, therefore, usurpations of law by the right and the left alike. As Rebecca Hill writes in an analysis of John Brown's abolitionist fervor, quote, scholars writing about John Brown in the 1970s connected his disturbing use of violence to the revolutionary left. Today's historians are just as likely to compare the antinomian Brown to right-wing evangelical Protestant militants as represented by the anti-abortion terrorist Paul Hill, unquote. The conflict that elicits these seemingly antithetical historical comparisons is at least as old as Sophocles' Antigone, in relation to which Jacques Lacan elaborates his reading of law, the drive, and jouissance in The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. Now, Antigone's resistance to Creon's decree that her slain brother's body must remain unburied expresses for Lacan a tension between the law of the state, as wielded by Creon, and the chthonic law, the law of the earth that Antigone associates with the unwritten laws of gods even older than Zeus. Lacan explains, quote, these are no longer laws, nomos, but a certain legality, which is a consequence of the laws of the gods that are said to be agropta, which is translated as unwritten. Involved here is an invocation of something that is, in effect, of the order of the law, but which is not developed in any signifying chain. Agropta, therefore, not a signifier, not written. This imperative that pertains to the order of the law, but that has to remain unwritten, unarticulated, and outside the signifying chain, pushes Antigone in Lacan's analysis to inhabit what he describes as the field of the other, the place beyond the limit of the human. In the process, it enacts her obedience to the Kantian moral law, whose demands exceed conformity to codified regulations. For moral law, for Kant, remains agrapta, unwritten, unlegislated, never defined in advance, and each person must formulate maxims of conduct that attempt to embody it, becoming thereby responsible for it and to it at the same time. Such a moral law effectively drives the subject beyond itself, beyond, that is, the self invested in the logic of desire, and toward the immortal self that perceives its desires, its self-interests, as pathological. I mean, this is simple standard Kantianism. If Lacan understands the death drive as carrying us past the limit of selfhood, placing the drive in relation to the real of jouissance, then the limit of the human that Antigone crosses is the limit of man-made law as it governs the notion of collective good and the good of the self alike. Like the slave woman invoked by Jacobs, Antigone appeals to an authority, a truth beyond the constituted law. And as the slave envisions the Queen of America drawing her sword on the president, so Antigone does violence to Creon's law in the name of a law unwritten. We must say of the Queen of America, then, and of Jacob's investment in the natural law whose higher authority she figures, that the violence implicit in her unsheathed sword raises questions like those Lacan poses in reframing the common view of Antigone. Lacan asks, is she, as the classic interpretation would have it, the servant of a sacred order, of respect for living matter? Is hers the image of charity? Perhaps, but only if we confer on the word charity a savage dimension, unquote. It is this savage dimension of the drive, with its inseparability from jouissance, that makes the invocation of unwritten law so dangerous and so appealing. The division of the law between codified ordinance and the unwritten principles that ground it, the latter permitting the fantasy that law is subtended by a concept of justice, animates the political engagement that keeps the law open to revision or reversal through the ongoing conflict of interpretation. If it thereby offers the prospect of a reimagined collective existence, this division also exposes the queerness, the libidinal relation to an abjected enjoyment that undergirds law as such. Where the specificity of written law is concerned, this takes the form of its positing of its own universal authority, while simply imposing the interests and protecting the enjoyment of particular persons or groups. Law, in other words, is always the law of a class, of a people. It serves a particular interest in the name of universality. And where the notion of the unwritten law is concerned, as both Antigone and the Queen of America make clear, it takes the form of an insurgence, that is to say, the jouissance of the unwritten law takes the form of an insurgence against the legitimacy of legal authority, an insurgence that enacts the enjoyment of transgression, and with it the insistence of the drive from whose grip the law purports to protect us. So the law, as written, protects us allegedly from enjoyment, from the drive, from the savagery of our neighbors. But it does so to protect the interests of particular classes. And its jouissance is the jouissance of the protection of those interests of those classes. The jouissance of the unwritten law is the transgression of the codified law. Rebecca Hill's work on radical politics lays out the risks in treating uniformly such appeals to a higher, uncodified law that would supersede the legislative prerogative of the state. She writes, "This antinomian claim to access God's plan, also made by Nat Turner, the famous rebellious slave in the South, is the principal claim to authority for people who are excluded from the process of lawmaking and legal participation in any society where religion plays a significant role in politics. While it is commonsensical that placing oneself above the law, particularly when justifying the use of force, can lead to terrible consequences, the labeling of such resistance as, by definition, anti-democratic carries its own risks. Those who level such charges as the antinomian heresy against anti-slavery activists in the 19th century not only must wonder with taking sides against Anne Hutchinson, but also should grapple with what it means to call for the rule of law in an era when slavery was officially legal. As such, attacks on John Brown's violence rest on the continuing erasure of the fact that slavery was a reign of terror," unquote. We might think about this just parenthetically in relation to the question Slovcho asked me yesterday after the talk about the danger of invoking the notion of violence. To renounce the invocation of violence in the context, say, of the reign of terror of slavery represents clearly a danger of its own. Now, my point is neither to endorse nor condemn the appeal to a law beyond the law, but rather to note that the authority of such an unwritten law is posited. It is assumed just as surely as the authority of written laws are posited by those who produce them. The unwritten divine or natural law rests on the same initiating violence of positing as an imposition and enacts, no less than the written law, a particular mode of enjoyment while purporting to regulate enjoyment universally. Rebecca Hill effectively makes this point in her characterization of slavery. By calling it a reign of terror, she justifies the mimetic terror of Brown's resistance to it. But the historical referent for the reign of terror was not, of course, the entrenched institution of an oppressive legal order, for example, the Ancien Régime, but rather the Republican attempt to realize, amid the chaotic politics of revolutionary France, the absolutism of a transcendent law come to earth with its righteous sword unsheathed to dissolve that legal order. Slavery may be seen as a reign of terror, but so too then must the dispensation intended by the Queen of America. For each embodies a form of enjoyment that the other aims to foreclose, even while invoking the other's enjoyment as a figure for the violent insistence of a drive that the law must constrain. And each, the antinomian violence and the legislative violence, from the other's perspective, exemplifies bad education by exhibiting the spectacle of a libidinal indulgence, the erotics of slavery on the one hand, and the violent brutality of Nat Turner's insurgents on the other, to which unbridled enjoyment gives rise. The Queen of America, of course, never raised her sword against the president. But when Nat Turner raised his sword against slave-owning families, his rebellion was quickly put down. After hundreds of blacks across the South had paid for his actions with their lives and with the loss of their rights to gather in public, to preach without having white persons present, to bear arms, or to travel unaccompanied, the slaveholders in Harriet Jacobs' neighborhood, quote, came to the conclusion, she writes, that it would be well to give the slaves enough of religious instruction to keep them from murdering their masters, unquote. If the hope of spiritual deliverance held out by this ideological instruction or education sought to prevent the enslaved from delivering themselves to the jouissance of armed rebellion, it ignored the fact that according to his own book, The Confessions of Nat Turner, quote, religion principally occupied Nat Turner's thoughts, unquote, from a very early age. And the spirit who urged him to rise up in rebellion against the serpent of the white slave owners did so by asserting that, quote, the time was fast approaching when the first should be last and the last should be first, unquote. Christian spiritual training, the very template of Western pedagogy's domesticating ambition, offered an absolute standard against which the slave owner too could be judged, and its moral imperatives could be seized upon by someone like Harriet Jacobs to rally opposition to slavery's widespread pedagogy of enjoyment. For as Jacobs' narrative repeatedly insists, slavery invariably schools in vice everyone it touches. Raised, as Jacobs describes it, quote, in an atmosphere of licentiousness and fear, unquote, the slave girl, however hard she tries to preserve her, quote, pride of character, unquote, willy-nilly finds that, quote, the lash and the foul talk of her master and his sons are her teachers, unquote. The children raised as the master's own may learn to emulate his eroticized manipulations of the slaves, but his slaves, who may carry the master's genes no less than the children he acknowledges, must learn to master their own resistance to his appropriations of their bodies and their wills. Jacobs recounts her own bitter instruction just after turning 15 in the sexual designs of Dr. Flint, the name she bestows on the master of the household in which she was kept as a slave. She writes, quote, he peopled my young mind with unclean images, such as only a vile monster could think of, unquote. And she decries the fact that for a slave girl like her, quote, there is no shadow of law to protect her from insult, from violence, or even from death, unquote. No shadow of law. To the contrary, the very law that places her in her master's hands gives license to his licentiousness. As property, she is fully his to enjoy and to cultivate for surplus value. Quote, everywhere the years bring to all enough of sin and sorrow, Jacobs writes, but in slavery, the very dawn of life is darkened by these shadows, unquote. Darkened by these shadows. What she calls the shadow of law may fail to offer her any protection, but that shadow returns in the darkness of evils described as shadows of sin and sorrow, that do, by contrast, find shelter in law, and that thereby shadow the shadow of law with their own particular darkness. Engaged then in a battle of wills, not only with the master, whose desires she spends the whole narrative tirelessly trying to thwart, but also with the hegemony of national opinion that makes him her master by law, Jacobs must work to discredit the law and solicit its protection at once. And that's the paradox. She must find the protection of the law and discredit it at the same time. Her project, that is, must try to distinguish the shadow of law as shelter from the obscenity that shadows the law itself. And it does so by affirming a principle of reason capable of restraining the irrationality of particular laws the irrationality of particular laws in the name of a universal one, in the name of a moral or natural law. And how better to image the darkness of vice that contemporary slave law sanctioned than by showing its inevitable complicity in the moral corruption of the young. Even the little child, Jacobs writes, who is accustomed to wait on her mistress and her children, will learn before she is 12 years old why it is that her mistress hates such and such a one among the slaves. Perhaps the child's own mother is among those hated ones. She listens to violent outbreaks of jealous passion and cannot help understanding what is the cause. She will become prematurely knowing in evil things, unquote. Later in Incidents, accounting her, quote, deliberate calculation, unquote, in taking as her own lover an older unmarried white man, Jacob employs this phrase once again as if to mark its importance. She writes, quote, "The influences of slavery had the same effect on me that they had on other young girls. They had made me prematurely knowing concerning the evil ways of the world," unquote. What is this knowledge that comes too soon, if not the knowledge evoked as inherently obscene that corrupts, perverts, or queers by waylaying innocence, polluting the mind, and consequently, as Jacobs writes, quote, "compelling the child to realize that she is no longer a child," unquote. Such knowledge enacts a violence made explicit by the reference to compulsion, compelling the child to realize, the violence of a spoliation that the text, repurposing the rhetoric of sentimental fiction, identifies as, quote, "moral ruin," unquote. Taking this as her central figure for the injustices of slavery as an institution, Jacobs posits as universal the law's responsibility to children, and by extension to the family in its putative role as safeguard of an innocence natural and innate. And she uses this to ground her appeal for support against laws that tolerate the obscenities of slavery, where obscenity finds its literal referent in sexual knowledge disseminated prematurely. But if innocence in this context entails freedom from the threat of an inappropriate knowledge, then the law whose sheltering shadow Jacobs aspires to gather around her would bar such contaminations by enforcing a liberal concept of privacy, one based on the principle of self-ownership that relies on the state as the public institution authorized to establish, regulate, and maintain the distinction between private and public. Extending Lauren Berlant's account of incidents in participating as what Berlant calls a counter-pornography of citizenship, unquote, Bruce Burgett makes this point by showing that Jacobs, quote, remains torn between her belief that sexual privacy ought to be a right accessible to all, and her realization that without acts of publicity, like incidents, privacy will remain a source of privation for sexually, racially, and economically exploited subjects, unquote. The privacy in which the sexual should find cover from this perspective should not afford a sheltering shadow to improper, immoral, or illegal acts. The state, therefore, reserves the right to adjudicate the line between private and public, thus opening the private to the very publicity, the very politicization from which the state was invoked to defend it. This pinpoints the difficulty that Jacobs confronts, not only in soliciting the shadow of law, but also in narrating her subjection to obscenities whose free circulation her text condemns as, quote, violating the most sacred commandments of nature, unquote. The South's peculiar institution, slavery, which she frames as peculiar not only in the sense of distinctive or characteristically its own, but also in the larger sense of aberrant, perverse, or queer, that is, as an affront to natural law, contaminates with the taint of obscenity not only her own blighted childhood, but also her very efforts to make known slavery's obscene circulation of premature knowledge. For as Lydia Maria Child anticipated, Lydia Maria Child was a white woman living in the North, an author who helped Harriet Jacobs publish her book. As Lydia Maria Child anticipated when she lent her support to the publication of Incidents, that text itself became vulnerable to the same charge it brought against slavery. In her editor's introduction to the text, Child has to defend the public presentation of indelicate subjects to the degree that such, has to defend the public presentation of potentially indelicate subjects to the degree that such publicity, such making public of the sexual, aims at, quote, arousing conscientious and reflecting women at the North to a sense of their duty in the exertion of moral influence on the question of slavery, unquote. But Jacobs, the former slave, can fulfill that goal, as this phrasing explicitly recognizes, only insofar as her text succeeds in exciting or, quote, arousing these women. So framed by Child, who served as Jacobs' editor and sponsor both, quote, the slave, as Deborah Garfield writes, must starkly impose her sexual ordeals on a white counterpart's bashful listening, becoming the satanic tempter whose candid whispers risk blighting the white auditor's purity. In other words, the very act of claiming the necessity of privacy for the sexual from the obscenity of the public dissemination of sexuality in the South reproduces the publicization of that obscene sexuality, which thus becomes subject to the very charge she brings against slavery itself. Once Jacobs localizes the violence of slavery in a sexualized knowledge that prematurely falls like a blight on children's souls, that blight, like the queerness from which it springs, attaches to all who engage it. Now let us pause for a moment. Suppose we were to place beside Jacobs' reading of American slavery as public obscenity the terms in which Vladimir Putin has defended Russia's law against gay propaganda. The point, of course, would not be to equate the experience of sexual minorities in Russia with that of African Americans subjected to chattel slavery and its long aftermath in the United States and elsewhere. Instead, it would be to gain some purchase on questions of sexuality, publicity, and law by seeing what Jacobs' representation of slavery as a system of obscene education shares with the official justifications of Russia's contentious law. That law, enacted in 2013, prohibits, wherever minors could possibly encounter them, utterances, acts, or representations that could, quote, arouse interest in, unquote, what the law identifies as, quote, non-traditional sexual orientations, unquote, or that might suggest their social equivalence to heterosexuality. In the case of contemporary Russia, as in Jacobs, North Carolina, the shadow of law is called on to shelter those children whose freedom from corruption is threatened by the distribution of images or ideas held to, quote, violate the most sacred commandments of nature, unquote, and so to vitiate youthful purity. As Russia's constitutional court affirmed in its decision to sustain the law, which was passed in the Russian Duma without a single vote against it, the government has a legal duty to, quote, take measures to protect children from information, propaganda, and campaigns that can harm their health and moral and spiritual development, unquote. Access to certain sorts of knowledge, even knowledge of legal relationships, since homosexuality, as Putin frequently reminds us, is not illegal in Russia, thus constitutes a form of bad education, a freedom that undermines freedom and destroys the foundation of civil society. Echoing American proponents of the law, including some who traveled to Russia in order to propagandize in favor of it, Vladimir Putin has suggested that, quote, by protecting children from the respective information, unquote, and that euphemism is necessitated by the law itself, since to use references specifically to homosexuality would risk violating the very law by naming the thing that the law is meant to keep unnamed. Protecting children from the respective information that is about the existence and oppression of non-traditional sexual orientations, it also protects society against a form of violence meant to enslave it. Putin says, quote, "It's about protecting us from rather aggressive behavior from some social groups who, in my opinion, are trying to impose their point of view in a rather aggressive way," unquote. If slavery for Jacobs was a queer obscenity, queerness for Putin is an obscene enjoyment. Before we get too comfortable, though, those of us who are from the West, in our putative liberalism, recall that in France, a vociferous movement has garnered significant public support for boycotts of schools on the basis of rumors that state-mandated curricula indoctrinate students in a gender theory that amounts to homosexual propaganda. Nor should we forget the continuing attempts in the United States as well, not without occasional success, to introduce statewide or local legislation prohibiting elementary and middle school teachers from mentioning homosexuality in any context, even in response to homophobic bullying. Like the infamous Section 28 of the Local Governments Act passed in Thatcherite Britain, both the Russian law and Jacobs' focus on the child made prematurely knowing by the obscenities of slavery view the child as a site of endangered freedom while defending familial structures that treat children themselves as a form of property. Indeed, a decade and a half before Jacobs would publish Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Karl Marx in the German Ideology wrote that, quote, "The nucleus, the first form of property, lies in the family, where wife and children are the slaves of the husband. This latent slavery in the family, though still very crude, is the first property," unquote. However critically he may view this structural domination that generates property, Marx nonetheless refers to it as, quote, "the natural division of labor existing in the family," unquote, where this allegedly natural organization of our earliest social relations arises from the fact that, according to Marx, it, quote, "was originally nothing but the division of labor in the sexual act," unquote, which is to say the dominant and the subordinate, male, female. Jacobs, like Marx, will implicitly naturalize the property rights of the family, so that for her, as for contemporary Russian law, and indeed for liberal thought in the West, the child, though deployed as a figure for freedom from enslavement to sexual corruption, has no symmetrical freedom to consent to encounter such knowledge. It has no claim to self-ownership, and so, like the slave, no freedom of will. Jacobs narrates an event from her childhood that encapsulates this tellingly. Her brother, Willie, being called upon to serve both his father and his legal owner simultaneously, quote, "was perplexed which had the strongest claim upon his obedience." It's like the Socratic image of the person placed between two equally desirable objects. He's immobilized by the impossibility of moving toward either. He didn't know which way to turn, literally. Finally, he determines that it's his duty to give priority of response to his owner in the eyes of the law, because his owner, of course, owns him. In the aftermath, however, his father reproaches him. "You are my child," he insisted, "and when I call you, you should come immediately if you have to pass through fire and water," unquote. The dilemma, like the emphasis Jacobs gives to the father's use of "my," makes clear the implicit structural parallel between the position of child and slave. So when Jacobs goes on in the following sentence to refer to her brother's subsequent fate in being sold to Dr. Flint, we might wonder, despite her assertion that, quote, "he was now to learn his first lesson in obedience to a master," unquote, if that first lesson hadn't already been taught. Indeed, a key distinction in incidents between enslaved women and those who are free is found in the latter's security in the possession, the ownership of their children. "They are your own," Jacobs writes, addressing herself to the free mothers among her readers, "and no hand but that of death can take them from you," she continues. While perhaps Jacobs underestimates the extent to which patriarchal privilege can conspire with law to claim free women's children too, She implicitly reads children as property that their parents have every right to own. Thus, the argument for keeping one's children from contact with anything that could possibly strip them of their freedom from premature sexual knowledge stands in as a figure not only for the enjoyment of freely exercising one's own authority as a parent over one's children, but also for the enjoyment of a larger authority to be gained in the name of the child, the authority over others whose freedom might encroach on one's property rights in one's own child. For freedom embodied in the figure of a child shows the paradox of freedom itself. It carries with it the libidinal enjoyment of subjecting the other to constraint, and so of restricting his freedom to impinge on property claimed as one's own. As the Russian Information Agency noted in a news article about the Russian law, whose very subject required a label describing it as unsuitable for those younger than 12, the Russian Constitutional Court, in sustaining the anti-gay law, determined, quote, that the exercise of civil rights and freedoms could not be permitted at the cost of other people's rights, unquote. A formula whose inconsistency, whose absolute reversibility reveals the shadow over any freedom seeking shelter in the shadow of law. So long, that is, as the state is positioned as the guardian of rights construed as deriving from the subject's property in himself, that self remains a property whose ownership the state alone can adjudicate. And the freedom of the subject will be delivered to constraint by the state in the name of freedom. How then should we respond to the fact that Frederick Douglass, in My Bondage and My Freedom, invokes a version of the Russian court's paradoxical formulation on rights and freedoms in order to make his case for the necessity of abolishing slavery? Although describing his old master, Captain Anthony, as capable of outrages, he puts it, dark, deep, and nameless, Douglass asserts that Captain Anthony, far from being a monster, was instead the unexceptional product of his upbringing, a victim, like Jacob's slave girls, of slavery's universally unclean influences. Douglass writes, had he been brought up in a free state, surrounded by the just restraints of free society, restraints which are necessary to the freedom of all its members, alike and equally, Captain Anthony might have been as humane a man and every way as respectable as many who now oppose the slave system, unquote. In imagining Captain Anthony as he might have been had he been brought up in a free state, Douglass denotes with the latter phrase those states that prohibited slavery. But that same phrase connotes a sort of freedom Captain Anthony has never known, the freedom that comes from restraining those freedoms associated with the excess of slave owning, and so with enjoyments properly condemned as unnatural and inappropriate. Having been raised in a slave state, Douglass implies, Captain Anthony was condemned to live in a state of slavery himself. For as Douglass observes of the slaveholder in his relation to the enslaved, reason is imprisoned here, and passions run wild, unquote. The wildness of those passages finds full expression in the scene where Douglass witnesses the whipping of his Aunt Esther, a famous scene that Douglass describes as, quote, a tempest of passion, a passion into which entered all the bitter ingredients of pride, hatred, envy, jealousy, and the thirst for revenge, unquote. Striping Esther's back with a whip while her hands are bound overhead by a rope, the master gives voice, as Douglass narrates, to all manner of harsh, coarse, and tantalizing epithets, while protracting the torture as one who was delighted with the scene. And here we see the enjoyment, the jouissance of this scene of the law's enforcement. Thus depicting what Christina Sharp aptly calls one of slavery's primal scenes, Douglass frames this moment in implicit relation to an earlier scene in his text, one in which he reflects on the joyous condition in which he spent the first 8 years of his life. Now remember, the first 8 years of his life, he was still a slave, but he was a slave child. Recounting his experience as a slave child, Douglass muses that, quote, the slave boy escapes many troubles which befall and vex his white brother, unquote. Elaborating this notion in a bravura passage whose rhetorical brio deftly effects an inversion of freedom and slavery, he redefines the sense of those terms while bringing out the upshot of bad education. And this is the passage from Douglas. And I didn't put it on the slide because I wanted you to hear the play of language. The slave boy seldom has to listen to lectures on propriety of behavior or on anything else. He is never chided for handling his little knife and fork improperly or awkwardly, for he has none to use. He is never reprimanded for soiling the tablecloth, for he takes his meals on the clay floor. He is never expected to act like a nice little gentleman, for he is only a rude little slave. Thus, freed from all restraint, the slave boy can be, in his life and conduct, a genuine boy, doing whatever his boyish nature suggests, enacting by turns all the strange antics and freaks of horses, dogs, pigs, and barnyard fowl, without in any manner compromising his dignity or incurring reproach of any sort. He literally runs wild. As Douglas depicts it, the natural condition associated with freedom corresponds, in fact, to the brute, unregulated passions that reduce the human to the status of a beast. Giving license to expressions of basest desires, the freedom bestowed on the slave boy here, a freedom from all restraint, enslaves him to the domination of instinct and bars him from the moral instruction thought to undergird civilized life. As Douglas goes on to declare in this passage, quote, "If the slave boy can only manage to keep out of the way of the heavy feet and fists of the older slave boys, he may trot on in his joyous and roguish tricks as happy as any little heathen under the palm trees of Africa," unquote. He may continue, Douglas writes, to roll in the dust or play in the mud as best suits him and in the veriest freedom, unquote. The slave's enjoyment of a happiness equal to what he might have known in Africa coincides with the distinctly ambiguous qualification of this veriest freedom. It is the freedom, after all, of a heathen to roll in the dust or play in the mud, the freedom to remain in perpetual thrall to whatever nature suggests. Reinforcing the importance he places on the just restraints of free society, Douglas's slave boy, who literally runs wild, anticipates Douglas's depiction of the slave owner, whose reason is imprisoned and whose passions run wild by virtue of the enjoyment to which he gains access through his slaves. Discussing, quote, what Thomas Jefferson called the boisterous passions of slavery, the unremitting despotism of the slave owners, and the degrading submissions of the enslaved, Saidiya Hartman maintains that these boisterous passions bespeak the dynamics of enjoyment in a context in which joy and domination and use and violence could not be separated, unquote. Douglas and Lacan might allow us to add that the scene of enjoyment expresses not only the despotism of the slave owners, but also their enslavement by, their own unacknowledged subjection to, what Douglas describes as the passions and what Lacan would call the drive. Unlike Lacan, however, Douglas, finding himself here in the company of Jacobs, Putin, and the Russian parliament, identifies the subject as such with reason and his passions with what enslaves him, proposing therefore that freedom is always the proper restraint of enjoyment. Distinguishing himself from the African heathen, whose anarchic enjoyment finds its counterpart in the obscenity of the American slaveholder, Douglas finds himself caught in the circuits of Western philosophical idealism. Ronald Judy makes a similar point in Disforming the American Canon, when he notes that Douglas accedes to the sign's subordination to its meaning in a way that establishes a connection between legibility and humanity. For Douglas, as Judy puts it, the sign's materiality, quote, becomes transparent in the act of reading. It has no meaningful value within the economy of signification, the value system which reading constitutes. This transparency of the material sign enables Douglas, Judy continues, to devalue writing per se by maintaining the fundamental immateriality of thought as discourse and situating value within that discursivity. In other words, for Douglas, buying into the logic of Western idealist reason, the materiality of the sign is the equivalent of the pure natural freedom of the body. And both must be subordinated to the idealized discipline of meaning, where meaning is what restrains the freedom of the signifier. In doing so, Douglas ascribes the domination of jouissance by rational thought, of materiality by the idea, the domination that Alain Badiou has situated at the origin of Western philosophy itself. Badiou, for instance, writes, quote, "The thesis according to which the libertine is unhappy, more unhappy than the wise man, is a foundational thesis of philosophy. It is Plato's thesis exactly. The evil person is unhappy. That's why, according to Socrates, philosophy works, because it's possible to tell people who have a choice between becoming tyrannical subjects of enjoyment or wise philosophers that the better choice is philosophy," unquote. In his recent translation of Plato's Republic, a translation that reimagines Plato's text to keep faith with its underlying energy, Badiou has Socrates give voice to a version of the thought that Douglas later echoes, identifying three agencies in the subject itself: thought, affect, and desire. Badiou's Socrates maintains that in the ideal social order, the rational agency will have to be dominant. And Socrates then adds, thought and affect will keep an eye on desire, so that, obsessed as it is with repeatedly seeking immediate pleasures, it doesn't try to enslave the other two agencies and take power over the whole subject, unquote. If philosophy in the West from the beginning intends the subjugation of desire as enjoyment, as jouissance, as the constant repetition of the drive, it defends that subjugation in the name of the subject's freedom to seek the good, the idea, the truth, through thought or reason. Unlike enjoyment, which each of us encounters in radically particular ways, the idea in Badiou's Platonic account of the philosophical tradition pertains to everyone without distinction, and so, as he puts it, must be universal. It must be free of any element within it that would prevent its being shared by all, unquote. But the idea as universal, like the idea of universality, can orient philosophy only by constraining the particularity of what Badiou and Badiou's Socrates refers to as desire, which Lacan calls jouissance. If this constraint serves the purpose of freedom, defined as reason's domination of the subject, then the freedom offered as the alternative to the subject's enslavement to desire requires the enslavement of desire to reason, and hence the enslavement of those subjects made to figure desire, jouissance, and the pressure of the drive, to those subjects figurally positioned as the social bulwark against enjoyment as such. As we've seen, however, what's at issue here for Jacobs, for Douglas, for Putin, and for us is a battle between competing figurations of freedom that stand in for or take the place of competing figurations of the subject. The philosophical subject on the one hand, who embodies the abstract universality of thought in the symbolic, and the psychoanalytic subject on the other, defined by the specificity of a jouissance that binds it to the real. This might look like a specular structure characterized by the absolute deadlock of positions that mirror each other in their symmetrical opposition. But that neglects a crucial difference that ruptures this seeming symmetry, a difference that can be seen by examining the case each version makes for its notion of freedom. The first case, that made for freedom as reason's necessary domination of desire, can easily be seen as bespeaking a desire for the freedom that reason promises. One chooses, after all, philosophy because one desires the freedom through reason that philosophy promises. Desire has not been removed from the system, it's just been re-articulated as reason. So that it proposes to constrain desire by instructing desire to desire the good. In doing so, however, it displaces rather than subjugates the faculty of desire, which continues its domination through the very mask of reason, merely representing as universal the particularity of its relation to enjoyment. I desire the good, therefore all should desire the good. The universalization of the particular enjoyment to be had in the abstraction of reason from desire becomes the basis for refusing free expression to the particularity of jouissance, a refusal that props up slavery and the rhetoric of abolition both, and that generates the figure of queerness as the other of universality, as what every universalism excludes. In his argument against the universalism he associates with Badiou, Etienne Balibar allows us to catch a glimpse of how queerness falls out of the universal. He writes, "The violent exclusion inherent in the institution or realization of the universal can take many forms, which are not equivalent and do not call for the same politics. A sociological and anthropological point of view will insist on the fact that setting up civic universality against discrimination and modes of subjection in legal, educational, moral forms involves the definition of models of the human or norms of the social. Foucault and others have drawn our attention to the fact that the human excludes the non-human. The social excludes the asocial," unquote. Philosophy, for Badiou and Plato, in positing the universality of reason as the good, abjects the enjoyment that attaches it to universalism in the first place, an attachment that philosophy recognizes as by no means universal, otherwise we would all be philosophers. Douglas and Jacobs make appropriate philosophical versions of the life. Douglas and Jacobs may appropriate philosophical versions of the life ruled by reason to cast slavery as a dangerous influence on those exposed to its obscenities, but philosophy in the West, from the outset, precisely as a form of enjoyment, has been attacked in the very same way. Indeed, for Badiou, the philosopher should merit the accusation brought against Socrates. For him, the philosopher's duty is explicit, quote, "to corrupt the young," unquote. And she or he does so by promoting what the order that is, the order of reality, must perceive as bad education, by promoting what he calls, quote, "the irresponsibility of thought in the face of what is established," unquote. The freedom of thought, in other words, to resist whatever law or transient opinion would constrain it. In cultivating this irresponsibility, though, this universal freedom of thought to conceive what the order of things makes unthinkable, philosophy, Badiou tells us, must instill this freedom as, quote, "a singular responsibility." It's not up there. A singular responsibility. The singular responsibility to a universal practice that universally repudiates the domination of the subject by the singularity of its desire. Consider now the case to be made for freedom in terms of psychoanalysis. The subject capable of, in terms of the psychoanalytic subject, the subject capable of acknowledging and identifying with the particularity of its enjoyment and not some universality. Though seemingly symmetrical, this freedom entails no correlative fantasy of subjugating reason precisely insofar as it recognizes reason as the persistence of jouissance. Thus, Mladen Dolar rightly observes, quote, "The renunciation of enjoyment itself produces enjoyment. The very act of renouncing is always ambiguous, and there is never a subtraction of enjoyment that wouldn't be at the same time an addition in the very same gesture. Fighting the enjoyment, which of course is what philosophy is trying to do, advocating a suppression of the enjoyment always turns into a remodeling of enjoyment, offering new ways of enjoyment rather than getting rid of enjoyment. Indeed, enjoyment appears as the one thing that can never be gotten rid of," unquote. In this context, we can better understand why Russia's constitutional court produced such nonsense by decreeing that, quote, "the exercise of civil rights and freedoms could not be permitted at the cost of other people's rights," unquote. Precisely insofar as enjoyment is particular and the restraint of any mode of enjoyment for some will generate enjoyment for others, the subject's freedom of enjoyment invariably opens onto conflict. By refusing our dominant view of law as protection against harm, the freedom of enjoyment, as Lacan makes clear, invokes a Sadian universe governed by Sade's still disquieting version of a Kantian categorical imperative. Quote, "Let us take as the law." And this is Sade's version of a universal maxim à la Kant. "Let us take as the law, as the universal maxim of our action, the right to enjoy anyone at all as an instrument of our pleasure." The right universally to enjoy anyone at all, which has as its corollary the right of anyone at all to use us as an instrument of her or his pleasure. Here we return with a vengeance to Jacob's cage of obscene birds, except for the reciprocity, to Douglas's image of passions run wild, to Putin's fears that information about non-traditional sexualities is itself an assault or an aggression. In response to the sort of repugnance the Sadian universe usually arouses, Lacan proposes the following. If the same opening is given to all, one will be able to see what a natural society is like. And you remember Douglas's description of a natural society. Our repugnance may be legitimately related to that which Kant himself claims to eliminate from the criteria of the moral law, namely to the realm of sentiment, unquote. Where Hortense Spillers, giving voice to what Kant thus consigned to the realm of sentiment, laments the fact that Harriet Jacobs could not, as Spillers writes, quote, "claim her body and its various productions as her own," unquote, the ethics that follows from the freedom of enjoyment disappropriates us all of such ownership, denying our property right in anything, including, in the first place, ourselves. Rejecting the bourgeois suppositions of the modern Western liberal consensus, Guy Ockingham's queer theory avant la lettre envisioned such a world in 1974, when Ockingham in L'Après-MEDFORD maintained that, quote, "In claiming sex as the property of the free and conscious person, one perpetuates the old deception. Our bodies belong to us. What sadness! That the body of each belongs to all who want to enjoy it would make a more satisfying formulation," unquote. Perhaps a more satisfying formulation, but not a more pleasurable experience. For enjoyment exceeds the pleasure principle, and in doing so exposes the gap on which every version of freedom founders, the gap of the subject's division between pleasure and enjoyment, between desire and drive. Lacan quotes Kant on the moral law in order to explain the consequence of the movement toward the only sort of act that might bespeak freedom for the subject. He says, quote, "We can see a priori that the moral law as the determining principle of will, by reason of the fact that it sets itself against our inclinations, must produce a feeling that one could call pain." Lacan then expands on this idea, saying, in brief, Kant is of the same opinion as Sade, for in order to open the floodgates of desire, what does Sade show us on the horizon? In essence, pain. The other's pain as well as the pain of the subject himself. For on occasions, they are simply one and the same thing. To the degree that it involves forcing access to the thing, the outer extremity of pleasure is unbearable for us. Unbearable for us. Unbearable, that is, to the subjects as which we recognize ourselves. If radical enjoyment propels us toward the thing standing in for the Lacanian real, for what never gets articulated in any signifying chain, but what remains our unwritten law, then this enjoyment that discovers the unbearable at the extremity of our pleasure expresses the absolute of freedom, where freedom is separated from sentiment, and the absolute of compulsion, where we become no more than the vector of the drive. Bad education invariably leads us to this insurmountable impasse of freedom, where we encounter the violence of positing from which the shadow of every law and so of every good emerges. The positing, that is, of a subject of freedom with which our desire might coincide. But the Lacanian act, which negates the subject of fantasy and so of naturalized desire, offers, in the words of Ed Pluth, quote, a way of thinking about manifestations of freedom without the usual presupposition of a sovereign, conscious subject exercising that freedom, unquote. It thus takes us beyond the imaginary realm, where freedom is mapped onto our comfort zone of mutuality and consent, of universally recognized human rights, and of protection from discrimination or harm. It opens onto the nightmare world of enjoyment as queer negativity. We can never own or own up to such queerness any more than we can escape it. Avowing it would misrepresent it as a prescription for the good. But if queerness is to remain an active concern, an ongoing challenge to social norms, and not just a name for the project of non-normative sexual normalization, then we have to confront the abyss of enjoyment from which queerness, like the will to restrain it, springs. The abyss of enjoyment that enslaves us to the lethal dream of being free. Lethal because it is also the dream of being free from queerness, whatever the names by which queerness may go, including blackness, femaleness, or differently abledness. And need I note that Harriet Jacobs inhabited all of those names. Freedom as an endpoint remains the master's self-universalizing property, the condition within which his mastery appears, and by means of which philosophy emerges. For just this reason, Lacan associates philosophy with the freedom of the master when he asks, quote, what does philosophy designate over its entire evolution, unquote. And he gives us this response. It's this: theft, abduction, stealing slavery of its knowledge through the maneuvers of the master, unquote. And what knowledge does the slave possess for philosophy to steal? Lacan responds by referring to, quote, the only thing that motivates the function of knowledge, its dialectic with jouissance, unquote. Philosophy appropriates, we might even say masters, the jouissance of the slave by its very disavowal of jouissance in favor of freedom, an idea whose contemplation the master enjoys by stealing the enjoyment of the slave. Which is why I end this discussion with Lacan's reply to a journalist who asked him if psychoanalysis didn't entail a repression of freedom. These words make me laugh, Lacan replied. I never speak about freedom.